At 8 a.m. in Minneapolis, federal agents raided the private office of Somali diplomat Safia Abdiwarsame.
At first glance, the building in Minneapolis looked exactly as it should. Quiet halls, polished floors, framed portraits meant to project dignity and order. Nothing about it suggested urgency, let alone danger. But that calm did not survive the morning. When federal agents entered the private office of Safia Abdiwarsame, the atmosphere changed instantly. The room was immaculate, carefully arranged, almost ceremonial. Yet behind the desk, concealed from public view, investigators found what no diplomatic space should contain. Black-wrapped bundles marked with cartel insignia. A handgun hidden inside a velvet-lined drawer. A silver suitcase filled with cash, stacked tightly, its weight impossible to explain through any legitimate income. For years, Safia had been known publicly as a cultural representative. A mediator. Someone praised for building bridges between communities, for promoting charity, education, and goodwill. Her name appeared at fundraising events, community meetings, and official gatherings. She spoke the language of service and unity. But inside that office the image collapsed. By mid-morning, admiration had been replaced by documentation. Financial records spread across evidence tables. Transaction logs, banking trails, and timelines that stretched back more than a decade. What appeared on the surface as charity funding revealed itself as something else entirely. Over 12 years, more than $180 million had been routed through foundations and outreach programs that existed largely on paper. The pattern was precise. 37 shell organizations. Hundreds of wire transfers disguised as grants and donations. Funds moving quietly across state lines and international borders, all converging into the same hidden accounts. These accounts were not just financial endpoints. Investigators quickly realized they were operational tools, used to move people and narcotics through channels protected by diplomatic privilege. What the public had seen as community relief now read like leverage. Donations were not acts of compassion. They were access points. Each payment opened doors inside city offices, nonprofit boards, and administrative systems that rarely questioned a diplomatic signature. The deeper analysts went, the clearer the structure became. This was not a lone official abusing her position. It was a system designed to operate invisibly. Before noon, the investigation escalated. Alerts moved through federal command networks as agents cross-checked financial data with travel records. That is when a second concern emerged. Safia was no longer in her office. She was already en route to Minneapolis, St. Paul International Airport. At the airport, nothing seemed out of place. Travelers moved through terminals without hesitation. Announcements echoed softly overhead. But one passenger stood out to federal observers. Safia arrived with diplomatic clearance, a first-class ticket, and a suitcase she carried without visible concern. She did not rush. Her movements suggested familiarity, as if departures like this had happened before. The timing raised alarms. Her flight was scheduled to leave the country within the hour. Agents monitored her position as final checks continued behind the scenes. Then a new alert reached the command desk. A maritime signal tied directly to her corporate network. A cargo vessel had departed earlier that morning. The ship's manifest listed nothing unusual. No freight, no commercial goods. But when analysts pulled the associated records, the listing changed. Human transfers. Narcotics consignments. All tied back to the same financial channels already under investigation. Beneath those entries was a number that shifted the tone of the entire operation. 120 missing American children. The arrest at the airport stopped one departure. It did not stop the ship already at sea. And as agents moved to secure Safia, it became clear that time was no longer measured in hours or days. It was measured in minutes. By early afternoon, attention shifted away from the airport and toward open water. The cargo vessel linked to Safia's network had been at sea for just over 3 hours. On paper that window looked small. In reality it was everything. 3 hours was enough for a ship to drift beyond immediate jurisdiction. Enough for tracking to become complicated. Enough for the people on board to disappear if the next decision came too late. Inside the Federal Command Center, the atmosphere tightened. Large screens filled with satellite feeds, shipping routes, and live maritime data. Analysts worked silently, tracing ownership records, signal pings, and registry numbers. The vessel itself was not new. It had appeared in shipping databases before, always under different shell companies, always following routes that avoided prolonged port inspections. Thermal scans began to paint a clearer picture. Movement across the upper decks. Heat signatures clustered near reinforced sections of the hull. Intercepted communications suggested a private security detail on board. Not casual guards. Trained operators. Rough estimates placed the number at around 60, armed with advanced rifles and compact launchers, the kind typically seen in conflict zones where witnesses rarely survived. At that point, hesitation was no longer an option. Federal agencies moved in coordination. FBI, DA, DHS, and the U.S. Coast Guard activated a joint response reserved for situations where failure carried irreversible consequences. The objective was clear and narrow: secure the children first. Everything else was secondary. As the vessel pushed steadily toward international waters, assets repositioned quietly. 2 destroyer escorts adjusted course offshore. Beneath the surface, a submarine moved into position along the ship's blind side, maintaining distance while feeding live sonar data back to command. Above the clouds, stealth drones lifted into the air, invisible to standard radar, tracking the vessel's movement without alerting those on board. Behind them followed a second wave. Intercept drones armed with disabling charges, deployed not to destroy but to control. Their role was to cut off escape routes, disable communications, and limit the defender's ability to reposition once contact was made. On the surface, fast response boats powered up, crews checking harnesses and equipment in near silence. The order did not come with ceremony. There was no countdown, no raised voices, just a single instruction transmitted across all channels. As the approach began, floodlights snapped on across the deck of the cargo ship. Figures moved quickly into position along stairwells and access points. The security teams on board did not scatter. They organized. They anticipated resistance and prepared for it, tightening their formations as the first drones dropped into position. Live feeds streamed into the command center as the operation unfolded in real time. Every angle of the ship mapped within seconds. Every corridor tagged. Coast Guard boarding teams hooked onto the hull and began climbing, their movements deliberate and synchronized. A strong wind pushed against them, but none slowed. Every second spent outside increased the risk to the children inside. Once aboard, teams split immediately. One group moved toward crew quarters. Another pushed for the reinforced cargo hold. Resistance was met with discipline, not chaos. The defenders repositioned fast, forcing federal teams to adapt under pressure. In one corridor, an operator was hit during the advance. He refused evacuation, staying in place to shield a small group of children already located behind a bulkhead. Commands cracked through radios in short, controlled bursts. The fight did not spread across the ship. It compressed, door by door, hallway by hallway. Then momentum shifted. Overhead, drones released their disabling charges at pre-marked points, sealing off fallback routes and cutting off coordination among the remaining defenders. Within minutes, several hostile operatives were neutralized. Others dropped their weapons as pressure closed in from every direction. Then came the confirmation the entire operation had been waiting for. All 120 children secured. The words repeated across channels, steady and unmistakable. For the first time since the vessel had left port, the clock stopped running against them. By the time the last resistance on deck had ended, the vessel no longer felt like a threat. It felt like evidence. Floodlights washed across the steel hull as the ship was brought under full federal control and guided toward a secured staging pier. What had been moving toward international waters now sat motionless, surrounded by armed patrols and surveillance units. As the children were escorted off the ship, the tone on the pier shifted. Medical teams waited with blankets and portable lights. Some of the children were silent, exhausted beyond tears. Others clung tightly to the uniforms of the agents guiding them forward. Every movement was slow and deliberate, designed to calm rather than interrogate. Rescue came first. Questions would come later. Inside the vessel, investigators began the methodical work of documentation. What they found beneath the surface confirmed their worst assumptions. Behind reinforced cargo doors, welded directly into the ship's frame, was a 3-tier containment structure. Each tier held narrow compartments, barely large enough for a child to sit upright. Metal latches showed signs of recent installation. Air vents were covered with coarse mesh. There were no names, only numbers. This was not improvisation. It was design. In the mechanical bay, a waterproof tablet was recovered, still powered on. Its final transmission logs were intact. The entries were brief, transactional, and chillingly clear. 120 units confirmed. Estimated arrival to buyer, 19 hours. Investigators did not react to the number. They already knew it. What froze the room was the line beneath it. Next procurement window, 14 days. The implication was immediate. This shipment was not an exception. It was one link in a chain. As containers stacked near the aft section of the ship were opened, the scale of the operation expanded further. Documents tied to 12 prior voyages. GPS logs connecting ports across 5 countries. Payment records linked to cryptocurrency wallets totaling more than $41 million. Each record reinforced the same conclusion. This was a supply system refined and repeated. The most disturbing discovery came from the captain's cabin. Hidden behind a removable panel was a plastic-sealed binder. Inside were profiles of 311 missing children from multiple U.S. states. Some pages were marked with green check symbols, others with red question marks. Together, they formed a map of selection, movement, and completion. Even seasoned investigators struggled to process the implications. Many had worked trafficking cases before. None had seen one protected so thoroughly by diplomatic access. Safia had not simply opened doors for criminals. She had constructed corridors where no one was legally inclined to ask questions. On deck, the final child was transferred to a Coast Guard transport. An agent watched as the ramp lifted and quietly spoke a sentence that carried across the pier. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the prevention of something that should never have been allowed to happen. The ship was secured. The children were safe. But the operation had only exposed the surface. The structure behind it was still intact, and the real investigation was only beginning. By early morning, the focus shifted away from the ship and toward what it had revealed. With the vessel sealed under federal authority and the rescued children transported to secure medical facilities, investigators turned to a different battlefield. Not water. Not steel. Paper, data, and access. Inside a fortified operations center, analysts gathered around screens filled with financial charts, timelines, and communication logs. The question was no longer who Safia Abduwaram was. That answer had already been laid bare. The question now was how far her system reached, and how many institutions had unknowingly supported it. When financial teams began pulling digital records, the structure unraveled faster than expected. Safia's influence had not been built through intimidation or violence. It had been built through access. Access granted by diplomacy, reinforced by charity, and protected by reputation. 37 shell foundations had already been identified. But behind them sat a second layer. 9 US-based nonprofit organizations, all registered legally, all receiving large annual donations. On the surface they appeared legitimate. Cultural programs, youth initiatives, community outreach. But transaction reviews showed consistent transfers flowing back into accounts connected to international handlers. What appeared generous in public was, in practice, a laundering circuit. Over 12 years, more than $186 million moved quietly through these channels. When analysts overlaid the financial timeline with missing persons reports, a pattern emerged. Each surge in funding coincided with clusters of disappearances across multiple states. Not identical, not obvious, but consistent enough to remove doubt. The deeper investigators went, the wider the network became. City records showed Safia attending more than 200 closed-door meetings with local officials, administrators, and community leaders. The agendas looked harmless. Partnership development, resource allocation, youth support initiatives. But paired with financial data, their purpose was clear. These meetings were transactional. Influence exchanged for silence. The most damaging discovery came from a seized laptop recovered from Safia's office. The correspondence stored inside was written in neutral, logistical language. Nothing overtly criminal. Nothing emotional. But once decoded, each message aligned with known trafficking movements. Asset transfers. Inventory adjustments. Deployment schedules. Some messages were sent minutes before ships departed or children vanished. Safia had not participated at the edges of the system. She had directed it. Her diplomatic status shielded her. Her charitable image legitimized her. Her network ensured compliance. And that network extended into institutions designed to protect the vulnerable. Investigators were no longer dealing with an individual offender. They were confronting an embedded machine. One internal memo captured the reality with brutal clarity. Remove her and the network bends. Remove the network and the city shakes. Subpoenas followed. Files were unsealed. Names surfaced. Assistants. Consultants. Cultural advisors. 2 local officials who had accepted donations totaling nearly $1.3 million over several years. Each revelation widened the scope. Each one confirmed how deeply the system had rooted itself inside legitimate structures. The arrest at the airport was not an attempt to escape justice alone. It was an attempt to outrun exposure. Because the power Safia had built was not made of weapons or walls. It was made of trust. And that trust was finally collapsing.